Now, they say misery loves company, so maybe this next item will bring us some comfort. Well, it seems load shedding, is what we call it, may have come to London. Yes, London, in the UK. Today, British households are being warned that they could be without power for up to 3 hours at a time if gas supplies run low. That's the word from their national grid, which runs the UK's electricity infrastructure. We're joined now by our London correspondent, Sally Patterson, who joins us live from the capital there. Thanks so much for your time this evening, Sally. Now, here in South Africa, our load shedding woes, or blackouts, as we've now started calling it, because that is what it is, are due to years of corruption, mismanagement, bad political decisions, lack of maintenance around our electricity supply. What is behind this warning today in the UK?
Well, the situation here in the UK is slightly different. These are unprecedented concerns that we're hearing on Thursday. The last time that we've heard anything like this was in the 1970s, where a number of industrial strikes and industrial action led to power having to be deliberately stopped around the country at certain times during the day in order to maintain supply. In fact, there was the so-called 3-day week in which companies were only allowed to function for 3 days in order to make sure that there was enough power to go around. I was speaking to people earlier on who remember those days in the 1970s. They remember using candlelight at home, which was rather unusual, but for younger children at the time, of course, quite exciting. Less exciting for those adults now who maybe are worried about their families, they're worried about keeping their homes warm, they're worried about maintaining their jobs, and there is a lot of concern over these reports that we're hearing today.
Now, we know in Europe many countries rely on gas, but we also know that the UK has North Sea gas deposits. So why this power supply concern now?
That's right. Now, something crucial to stress is that what we're hearing from National Grid is very much a worst-case scenario. They're really stressing that this is an unlikely situation that we'll find ourselves in as we go into winter. However, they do want it on the cards as an option which could happen. And so I think the point is they're making provisions, they're making it clear that there are plans in place if we did lose the energy that was needed to keep Britain going, to keep the power pumping around the country. As you say, we do have a number of different power supplies here in the UK. Around 40% of energy here does still rely on gas-powered power stations. And so that, of course, relies on gas coming into the UK. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has seen widespread disruption of gas supplies around the world, and, of course, significantly into the European Union. The UK is not a member of the European Union as of 2020, but we do still trade with other European countries which are part of the EU. And so the real concern is that those EU countries, those member states, aren't able to get the gas that they need, therefore aren't able to send it over to the UK, and therefore aren't able to keep our power stations going. Now, there are other forms of power that we do rely on here in the UK. For example, offshore and onshore wind farms are increasingly in the front line as potential backups, not only as a renewable option, which is of course important for sustainability goals, but also as a backup for relying on gas, especially from Russia. Now, the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, has said that he's going to be reducing the restrictions on new wind farms being put in place around the UK and hoping to get that capacity up by about 15%. And he says that this will all help the UK become a more sustainable country. But there is a real concern that without that gas coming in, there will have to be these power disruptions as we go into winter. And that could mean that 3 hours a day in certain parts of the UK, a power supply is completely cut off in a controlled way of ensuring that there is enough power around the country. Now, what National Grid is saying is that that would be pre-planned. Households would be warned in advance if they were going to have their power shut off, and it would probably be during what it's calling peak times, which is around 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. And there are other restrictions and suggestions being put in place in order to ensure that we don't get to that point. For example, incentives for people to use energy at other times of the day. So, for example, running their washing machines overnight rather than during those peak hours of energy consumption. Same with charging electric vehicles. And there might even be energy suppliers who are giving out incentives, monetary incentives, for their customers who choose to use electricity and power at other times of the day in order to make sure that we don't get to that worst case scenario.
Now, there's South Africans watching this and listening to all of that, especially the incentives, and they're like, we've just been doing our washing when we can, when we think we're going to have electricity. So they're thinking you guys are set up for a great time. But outside of that, however, Sally, I mean, this comes very shortly on the heels of a huge spike in the price of electricity in the UK. People waking up to their bills having skyrocketed within just a few weeks. What's the reaction been from the public so far in this short space of time since getting the news of potential load shedding?
There's certainly already a feeling of concern, a feeling of fear here in the UK. As you say, many people have already seen their energy prices, their energy bills really soar, especially since the 1st of October when we saw the price cap change, which meant that some people's bills doubled in just overnight. Now, the government did intervene as it promised it would when Liz Truss was running to be Prime Minister, and it has reduced the amount that people are going to be paying. And so the average household should be paying around £2,500 annually, although, of course, there will be people paying more and there will be people paying less. The government is stressing that that is less than if they hadn't intervened. However, for many people across the UK, that's still an unattainable amount to be paying every year. There are people who are already using food banks, and there are people even starting to think about warm banks, which are like food banks, but places that people can go to be in the heat for certain hours during the winter for people who aren't able to heat their own homes. So it really is very concerning.
Oh, and any word on, I mean, I know you've said this, they've been, the message has been this is a worst case scenario, but have they spoken about what they'd call it? We call it load shedding. Most of us now call it power cuts. We call it because we call it what it is. Would communication come from the national grid? How would that work? Because over here, because communication was so bad from government or from ESCOM, there are some young guys who created an app that millions of people now live by because they are far more dependable in giving out information about when our time slots will be, when we have power or without power.
Well, so far we have seen quite clear communication from National Grid itself. When it put out this report, it said we may need to interrupt supply to some customers for limited periods in a managed and controlled manner. So that's their approach to this. They are making it clear that this is going to be deliberate, it's going to be planned, it's going to be thought through in order to avoid random power cuts, as is the concern if the UK does run out of that power that it desperately needs. So I think the idea is that they want to show that they've got a plan, they're going in controlled, they're doing this in a controlled way. The government as well have already voiced their support for these plans that are in place, and they've said the UK has a secure and diverse energy system. We are confident in our plans to protect households and businesses in the full range of scenarios this winter in light of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. So there's already been very carefully constructed language there about planning ahead, about worst case scenarios, and about trying to let the British public know that these are scenarios. This isn't what's likely to happen. That's really been stressed. These are worst case scenarios, and as I say, there are a whole bunch of different approaches and systems that are going to be put in place before we allow it to get to that position. But there are a lot of people looking to National Grid and ultimately to the government for clear leadership and for what's going to happen over the winter months, which many people are very, very concerned about.
Well, deliberate, planned and thought through. My, oh my, South Africans really wish that we could have used those words when it comes to our so-called load shedding. London correspondent Sally Patterson there joining us live from the UK, from their capital. Very, very interesting developments there. With so many South Africans living in London, I can just see them walking around trying to explain to people about this very handy app called Eskom Se Push and how you're supposed to pronounce it. But that's a conversation for another day.